Welcome back. You're watching Global Today. Now, the African Union celebrates its 60th anniversary on May the 25th, commemorating its achievement in the last 6 decades from the time it was known as the Organization of African Union. While marking the 50th anniversary, African leaders came up with the Silencing of a Gun initiative as part of the African Agenda 2063, with the leaders resolving not to pass the burden of conflict to future generations. Now, the objective was to free the African continent of wars, civil conflicts, humanitarian crises, human rights violation, gender violence, and genocide. Let's just hack back into history and find out how it began and how also tomorrow that day will be marked. Take a look. And so this month has been, the month of May has been the African month. That will be the culmination of African Day tomorrow. That is May the 25th. And the commemoration of Africa Day is, of course, also commemorating the organization that was then Organization of African Union, now African Union. And we want to look at the milestones so far. And we'll be joined also momentarily via Zoom link with the former Deputy Chair of African Union, Erastus Mwencha, who is not in the country, also to just give us a feel and flavor of what to expect tomorrow and so far to look at the milestones. Now, according to retired Ugandan diplomat Harold Asema, he says it's not a surprise that the African Union failed to meet the 2020 targets because trends show that just like in the 1970s and 1980s, it is reverting to a situation where power comes from the barrel of a gun, not the ballot. And he says what is also happening in Sudan, where power comes from the barrel of a gun, not the ballot, and what is happening in Ethiopia not long ago shows that the struggle for democracy in Africa has fallen on hard times. And instead of marching forward, Africans appear to be marching back to the era of military coups and counter-coups. Ahmed Hashi, you want to comment on that? And we look also...
Well, the most important political issue of our time, of the future and of the past, is the union of Africa. To me, it's the most important issue in my political thinking and the rest of the panel here. And I think that the failure of the African Union is spectacular. It is spectacular in its incisiveness, in the way in which it commits to failure, rather than to the great cry of the great father of the African Union, the Honorable Kwame Nkrumah. And therefore, Debal, I put it to you that it is very important that three things happen. That the nation states in Africa cede sovereign authority to the African Union and to the Peace and Security Committee. And for there to be a military group in the African Union that has got contributing countries from all the countries, and particularly the strongest and most powerful countries we have in the continent. And so that things like Khartoum and Sudan do not happen. Number three is, Debal, is that the chairman of the African Union should represent, and I've said that repeatedly over years, and President Ruto has adopted that, should be the only single person going to the world meetings with the rest of, say, Russia, United States, and all these other people. We should not troop 54 African presidents. Some of them are in Switzerland, you know, in deathbeds, because they have been in they have been presidents for life. Debal, you know that across West Africa now, the coups and the overthrow of civilian governments is rampant. There is nothing I can point to that the African Union has done that is going to make me go home and say something good is happening in Africa. It's not there. And how do we start?
Today.
I think the most important thing is to understand the African Union from the point of view of regionalism. And if the regional states and South Africa, Great Lakes, East, West, North are grouped in the Union in that way, I think it is easier for the African Union to work. But when we look at Africa from the point of view of a nation state, then we have problems. Because, Debal, you know, we have nation states which are anachronisms. For an example, Djibouti, Togo, South Sudan, the secessionist clan in the north of Somalia. These nation-state issues we have to oppose. And if the African Union is to work, the African Union needs teeth. And where does it get its teeth from? It gets its teeth from the states. And the states have to give it its teeth. But if the states decide that the African Union is going to be a moribund organization in which they go and have chapati every other 6 months, then all bets are off. I put it to you then, my friend Debal, is that the most critical thing about us turning the corner on the issues of the economy and the issue of politics and the issue of culture is not to do it in-house, in-state, inside your nation state, but to have a renaissance of the African transformation. We all want to pursue this transformation, this renaissance, because we know that our futures and our destinies are tied together. What is the reality, Debal, of the world today? You have ASEAN, you have the European Union, you have the North American Free Trade, is practically a North American Free Trade Agreement is a country now. You have the Pacific, the Australians and the New Zealanders. Debal, and Africa is looking for secessionism, while the rest of the world is trying to come together. There are groups in this continent that are putting up a flag. Every tribe and every clan wants a flag. I put it to you, things like Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda are meaningless. We must have an East African home, which includes all the countries of the eastern seaboard of East Africa. And if we don't, in an adroit way, pursue this form of happiness for our citizens, the African Union is going to be the laughing stock of the world. And I'll tell you why. Yesterday, Debal, or was it the day before yesterday, the world went to Hiroshima. The world went to Hiroshima to go and talk about Russia and things like this. There was no one African representative there. Not one. They didn't even call the African Union. They called India. They called Brazil. They called the Arabs. They called all of them. They called everybody.
They called the UN.
They called the UN. They did not call the African Union. I thought probably they would call South Africa. They didn't. Because the Americans are busy saying that they were packing bullets into cartridges and sending it to Ukraine, which turned out to be a blatant lie. I put it to you, Debal, that the world doesn't give 2 cents about our continent. And we are the ones who have to give 2 cents about this, or 3 cents about this continent. And if the political leadership and the people of this continent do not understand where the world is, I've repeatedly said on this program that the international political economy is spinning on the axis of a modern spindle in a way that makes you gasp, because today they're talking about artificial intelligence, actual artificial intelligence, who you talk to, who is your partner, who can drive you to work. We are still dealing with mud hats and the curriculum and what kind of education we should have and how are we going to empower our people. And how are we going to do that, Debal? It's by making sure that this African Union works, where we pull all our resources, where we pull all our intellectual abilities, where we pull all our issues together and follow the path of the great Nkrumah, who said, "Seek ye the political kingdom first."
Thank you. Professor Kagwenja.
Well, Africa has what it takes to be a superpower.
Yes.
So the idea of African Renaissance is not, utopian. We are now number 2 in terms of population. We're sharing here with my brother. We are number 2 in terms of population with 1.433 billion people, almost catching up with China, which is 1.455 billion, and slightly ahead of India, which has 1.425 billion people. We control 65% of the world's minerals wealth on average, but there are areas where we control 85% of certain very strategic minerals, particularly the one for energy storage and related matters. very, very important. Therefore, what is wrong with Africa? What is wrong with Africa is what Nkrumah said in the 1960s. First, Africa must unite. That was his thesis. And he went ahead to show how Africa, what Africa must control. We must control the towering heights of our continent, which is the economy, the foreign policy, and our defense. Now, the Organization of African Unity did its part, which is basically to liberate the continent, and it did. You can say whatever you want to say. David Ram and other authors ridiculed it, but it delivered the continent from colonialism. But it could not deliver the country, the continent from neocolonialism, which was Nkrumah's problem. Nkrumah's problem was not the political kingdom. After we got the political kingdom, which we did, we now had to move to the economic kingdom and diplomatic kingdom, and that's where we are losing it. Now, the African, Nelson Mandela and Thabo Mbeki talked about African Renaissance. They popularized it, including creating a whole department at the University of South Africa, headed by a Kenyan Professor Shadrach Guto at the Renaissance Institute, and Renaissance Journal and everything. We talked about Africa rising, but what's the problem now? The problem is simply that neocolonialism is still behind us. Now, the African Union perhaps received a larger number of ambassadors from the West than even the United Nations. In Addis Ababa is basically, those are the ones that are governing, and they attend the African Union like it's their work, right? So Africa has no free space to decide its own destiny. China sits and decides its own destiny. India sits and decides its own destiny. Africa cannot decide. The battle for the chairmanship of the African Union is like we are fighting for the United Nations Secretary General, or worse. And therefore, ask Amina Mohammed what happened. Ask Dlamini Zuma in South Africa and what happened. The truth of the matter is that African Union is now used as a vehicle for neo-colonial domination by very many, the former colonial powers. I can mention here largely Britain, Germany, and France. Those are the three powers that are, and then the United States. America has two ambassadors in Addis Ababa. One for the African Union, and the other one for everything else, including Ethiopia. Why is this? Because it has become very cheap to colonize Africa, to recolonize Africa. It's very cheap. You just need to colonize the African Union and get other countries to toe the line. That's it. So the country, Africa is a huge continent. Therefore, as we celebrate the Africa Day tomorrow, it will be a sad, it's very sad that we have not managed to break the chains of neo-colonial domination. And the African Union is supposed to be our liberator. It is now the one that is enchaining us to the new colonial position. And I say this as one of the of those who was an intellectual in the formation of that. I remember my visa from Chicago to Pretoria is punched. It's a business visa to South Africa to go and support the creation of NEPAD and the African Union. That's my visa to South Africa in 2002. And when we sat down and restructured, I can recall Muammar Gaddafi, and the death of Muammar Gaddafi in the hands of the West it was the beginning of the end of the African Union. We will have to retrace our steps. We will have to retrace our steps. Gaddafi is the person who single-handedly, together with a few others, Senegal, Nigeria, South Africa, who funded the reform, Thabo Mbeki specifically, funded the reforms of the African Union. Now, everything has been taken over by Europe. One, we cannot pay our bills. We have to wait for our bills to be paid by the West. And Kagame was on this issue. In his tenure as chair, his main agenda was how Africa can pay for its own bills. Because until we are able to pay our own bills, we cannot be independent. Two, there is a scramble for Africa, and we have become flower girls in every meeting. Okay, we are members of FOCAC. European unions have their own summit. The US has now its own summit. India has its own summit, and Brazil has its own summit. We have just left the Russian summit.
Yeah.
Stupid people we are.
Yeah.
We are in every corner, and we don't have a good structure.
But stupid is such a strong verbiage.
No, he's right. It's
No,
actually the right word.
The point is,
It's the right
we
word.
go and agree on agenda with the Russians. We agree with the agenda with the Americans.
He's absolutely
we agree
right.
with the agenda with the European Union. We agree on the agenda with India. We agree with the agenda with the Tokyo, with the TCAD. We agree with the agenda. What are we? What is the African policy on
There's
Japan?
no policy.
Yeah.
What is the African policy on China? What is the African policy on Russia? What is the African policy on America?
All right,
Dibal.
Dr. Mustafa.
No, I agree with what Professor Kagoni. We are foolish.
Yeah.
Yes.
And President Ruto in South Africa, I think, recently said
He did
that,
a great thing.
first of all, at the Security Council, the minimum Africa should be having at the Security Council are 2 countries, okay?
Yeah.
2 members from Africa. Then I think earlier he said that, what kind of an Africa Union do you have that cannot even pay
It's dues.
its dues, cannot even maintain ATMIS or AMISOM in Somalia? I mean, we have to wait for the Germans to pay for staplers at the Africa Union. The thing here, Dibal, that I'm saying that we really are foolish, and I think, and our leaders represent this foolishness at the Africa Union is, how can you have Washington Africa Summit, Beijing Africa Summit, and the president also said this, at one sweep you have 54 heads of state in Beijing or in Washington DC. Even Pakistan now has Pakistan Africa Summit.
Pathetic.
Had it as a pack,
Pathetic.
It's pathetic. And you're given, President Ruto said you're given 1.5 minutes to speak in those summits. You cannot transact nothing. These countries in the West are very transactional with African countries. And because of this foolishness that we come and, everybody is bilaterally going and looking at their small corner, and we can't do much. It is good we are celebrating, tomorrow, the day, and there are many things to celebrate, except that I think we are taking steps in the backward direction. We are moving backwards. Sloganeering is not going to help AU, the Africa Union. Silencing the guns. I think this started 10 years ago, or is it 7, 8 years ago? Today there are more guns and not just guns in Africa and Africans opening fire at each other. We have mercenaries on African soil.
Yes.
And not just from the Wagner. There are so many mercenary groups operating from the Sahel to the Horn of Africa to Mozambique to the DRC today. And what are they? These are mercenaries that are coming from outside of Africa.
Yes, indeed.
And we have actually allowed for war to be privatized. And the Africa Union isn't doing much about that. How are we going to move forward? Dibal, Professor mentioned about the demographics. This is important. Of the 1.4 billion people living in Africa, 70% are below 30 years.
Yes.
70%.
Yes.
So even as we are talking about Vision 2063, what kind of plan do we have for this 70%? In terms of industrialization and creating jobs? I'm happy that Nigeria has just launched the largest, biggest single train refinery that can do 650,000 barrels a day refining crude oil. That is the direction that we should be. Nigeria should have taken this, should have done this 40 years ago. Why is it that it's only possible to do it today? And if you look at the history and Aliko Dangote and what he has done, he has actually defied, he has defied international institutions to establish that oil refinery. We cannot wait for World Bank, IMF, and others to come and tell us what to do. We have to do what we need to do, even at the risk of getting invaded. Gaddafi did what he did. Professor mentioned about that. It costed him his life. I think African leaders have to stand up fearlessly. Stand up for Africa.
All right. Okay, let's hear from Noah Midamba, then we'll cross over to Erastus Moensha, who was also the former deputy chair of the African Union, to see if he's holding with the views that are actually being put forward
and
on
by
this
the way,
table.
just to add, I think during the time of Lamini Zuma and Moensha, I think a lot was achieved around that time. We actually now see a regression
So this is
with the current leadership.
Okay.
Yes, they are. We need to talk about positive as well as we must challenges that we face in Africa. There was ECOWAS effectively intervene on the Gambia situation. I think that the Somali AFCOM has been a mix of success and failure, but at least we were able to witness a government elected by the people and a smooth transition from the previous president to the new one. And there are other things that is happening in Africa. However, Dibal, there is a colossal failure in the continent as a whole. And we ought to be ashamed on us. We cannot blame America, we cannot blame Russia, Chinese, and everybody who's coming here. The civilian government has failed seriously, and that invite coup in the Sahel region, Sudan, as we are witnessing right now, challenge in Ethiopia. We have a lack of open sky. That should have been done a long time ago. Right. I flew to Entebbe the other day, and there was a little jet sitting there called Uganda Airline. What is Uganda Airline? The British left East African airline, and then we're now splitting into little airline. And there is only one airline in Africa today that is profitable, and that's Ethiopian Airline. Even South Africa Airline regressing, failing. The African trade is at 15%. We are trading with each other. Europe is trading with each other at 75%. And Asia, 50%. And so how can we penetrate through a market like that? Then we are borrowed. We are borrowed to our neck in order to feed chicken, Dubai. And you're looking at the whole country, it's mortgage. The future of our country is mortgage. So weak commitment to institutional building. We don't believe in the institution. And that's why Chinese have to come and build our conference in Ethiopia, conference hall in Ethiopia. And that's why the rest of Francophone Africa are going to France. That's where their money are kept and dictated on what they need to do. The East Africa community has a future. But within that East Africa community, the BAL has set on the Inter-University Council of East Africa. Some member states have not paid their dues. Yet, they have their own jets. Presidents have their own jet to go to New York for a conference and all that. But they have not paid their own dues to the institution. They're waiting for America to come and help. Russia come and help us. Chinese come and help us. So there is no coherent commitment, strategy to relieve Africa for Africa and redirect the African continent. So the question is, we're talking as intellectuals, we're talking as people who are exposed, we're talking as people who are inspired. To the extent that we just talk, and there is a lot of written material coming out of we don't Singapore and the Lee Kuan Yew execute at 99% of their strategy, whatever. And the measure, the yardstick, where they come from yesterday, where they are today, where we are in the future. We have to examine ourselves.
Thank you.
As people.
Thank you.
And we have to blame ourselves as people. Right. That's why the word foolish is correct.
The word foolish and stupid is correct to that particular. I wonder what the former deputy chair of African Union, Ambassador Erastus Muncha, who is joining us via link, he will be telling us where he is from, he's talking from this morning. And Ambassador, just to maybe pick your brains and to contribute on what you've heard from our panelists here, we are seeing African Union has failed, first of all, to meet the 2020 targets because trends shows that just like in the 1970s and 1980s, we are going to a situation where power comes from the barrel of a gun and not the ballot struggle for democracy in Africa is really fallen on hard times, and we can say we are marching forward, or we can say are we marching back according to your own assessment, or we are marching forward?
Thank you very much, Dibala. I hope you are getting me.
Yes, we are.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. First of all, good morning. And I want to say kudos to my colleagues there this morning, and I've enjoyed listening to them this morning. Dibala, let me just give some historical perspectives, just to build on what Kawanja and Hashi, and of course what the professor, all of them have said, then build us a context for us to understand why Africa is today as it is. In the run-up to establishment of Organization of African Unity in 1963, there were two schools of thought. One was known as the Monrovia Group, and the other one Casablanca. Now, the Casablanca School, which was led by Ghana, believed that Africa should be united and they should have formed the United States of Africa, then in 1963. But the Monrovia Group, which was led by Liberia, but also Ethiopia, Tanzania, believed that Africa would only work well if we went in small groups. West Africa, Eastern Africa, Southern Africa, much of it was still under colonialism or apartheid and North Africa. And that's, to me, the genesis of the problem. But of course, should also see it when you judge what Africa's progress has been in that context. When the debate took place in Addis Ababa in 1963 May, Nyerere and Nkrumah could not agree on one way forward. At the end of the day, Nyerere carried the day, and it was agreed that we go by groups, East Africa and the rest. What happened then? AU decided at that time, OAU, to create regional economic communities for economic emancipation of the continent. Whereas at the continental level, they decided to establish what you called a liberation movement. And Kawanja has talked much about that, and I totally agree with his point of view, that the liberation was one of the big tickets for the Organization of African Unity, but also to struggle for unity. There was also an important decision was taken in 1963. One, to create a financial arm, which is the African Development Bank, which is again, and I am actually here in Sharm el-Sheikh attending the annual general meeting of the African Development Bank. But also then decided to empower the Economic Commission for Africa to create regional economic groupings. That is how we ended up with East African Common Market for Eastern and Southern Africa, COMESA, ECOWAS, ECAS, and the rest. So if you are judging Africa, then you have to say what has been done. What has been done by regional economic communities should be seen in that context. What has been done by the continent. And then, of course, come 1980, Africa decided that regional economic communities are not making progress fast enough. And it's true, because you remember East African community collapsed, ECOWAS had its own challenges, ECAS has never taken off, AMU, Maghreb could not agree. But at that time, then we started seeing the formation of others, like the PTA for Eastern and Southern Africa, which then became COMESA. A decision then was made that let's now have an economic blueprint for the continent, which was known as the Lagos Plan of Action. Fast forward, come 1991, the Abuja Treaty for Economic was established. So economic integration only started in 1990s when the Abuja Treaty was established. And that ran for about a decade. Come 2002, this was now translated to form the AU. And that was done after having reviewed all the progress that has been made and agreeing that now there is time to create a continent-wide movement towards that. So what is the second problem that has also occurred? Conflicts, intra and regional and interstate. Africa decided at the beginning that we recognize boundaries as inherited from colonial masters, without which we would have had a lot of problems. And you know what has happened over the years. That's how you ended up with Eritreas. That's how you ended up with countries, Somalia is still having that problem, South Sudan, and all this. Because without that, you would have had a big challenge because colonial boundaries were arbitrary. Now, moving forward where we are today, Africa's focus then, especially coming to the program for Agenda 2063, which of course, and I want to agree particularly with what Mustafa was saying. When we looked at 50 years after independence in 2013, we're asking ourselves, what has Africa achieved all these years? Then we said, look, let us now create a long-term blueprint, which will say, in 2063, where
Well, I think
first of all is to move towards a trade arrangement, an economic arrangement. That's why now you have the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. And if you look at the program of the Continental Free Trade Area, the way the countries have gone about to try and implement it, I must say, is quite impressive. Although it's under the treaty making, ratification, and domestication. But the test of the building will be whether we can see implementation in tandem with what has been done. And yes, Africa now is starting to assume that continent-wide acceptance as a spokesperson for the continent. That's why you can see Kenya now is saying, yes, let us not go and start talking as 55 states, but as one. And I agree with what is being said. Up to now, Africa has been torn, and the colonial masters never let go. Yes, they gave us the flag, but they never gave us economic independence.
Thank you.
And that's where the struggle is.
Right, thank you. Thank you. Good input there from the former Deputy Chair of the African Union, Erastus Mwencha, speaking to us from Zambia. And even as we are winding up on this particular talk on the African Union, I just wanted to put back the question of the silencing of the guns and what he's really talking about so far, and what I had mentioned regarding Harold Asema, saying that we now, it seems in Africa, power is coming through the barrel and not through, democracy or government.
Very good. I like Mwencha. He talked and looked like Kenneth Kaunda when he was talking. I think it's because he's drinking Zambian water.
But he's not done any Kaunda suit, so I thought maybe...
you could not see. You could only see the head.
Yeah.
As on a lighter note, I think the idea of silencing the guns in Africa is a great idea. It was mooted by one of my friends, Lesotho, who is heading those African Union, Dr. Havere Matrosa. He's the one who is very, very keen on that kind of idea, together with his friend, the former Prime Minister of Sudan, Abdallah Hamdok. They are the fathers and the founders of this concept of silencing the gun from our days in South Africa. They have now institutionalized it within the African Union. A great idea. But it sounds to me like the old story about Mahatma Gandhi and the Western civilization. And when he was asked what he thinks about Western civilization, he quipped very quickly that it's a good idea. In other words, it's still something that's an idea. It's not reality. Now, the point with the African Union is that there was a point at which we were saying conflict was almost becoming a past tense in Africa. But now it's coming back with vengeance. And why is this? When you read the strategies of the major powers that are now fighting in what is emerging as, they call it low intensity, Third World War, because this is basically what it is. It's a low intensity Third World War, very hot in Ukraine, but very low in other areas. So we have entered the Third World War, and this is unique because everybody is afraid about the nuclear arms, because they know that will destroy the whole world. At the same time, the imperative to fight is there. Therefore, you're trying to use conventional weapons to see whether you can win a conventional war against a nuclear power. And Africa is now the battleground. Why is it the battleground? Because of what I said earlier, that we control over 60% of the world's strategic resources. Now, the battle in Sudan, and I dare say, has nothing to do with the Sudanese.
Absolutely.
Absolutely, there's nothing to do with the Sudanese. Because Hemedit is the deputy to Burhan.
He's Janjaweed.
Yes. No, the point is, he's no longer Janjaweed. He has been empowered that now the militia is stronger than the state or the constitutional military.
And it's the state that created that.
And it's the state that created that militia.
No.
But in this regard, we cannot silence the guns if situations as are obtaining in Sudan continue to obtain. In Congo, we have seen the resurgence of M23. Never mind the intervention by the African Union, by the East African Standby Force. At the same time, we are seeing issues Central African Republic. We've seen resurgence in Mali, Niger, the terrorism. And by the way, and Mustafa is the expert in this area, there is nothing like terrorism per se.
Correct.
Much of it is proxy war in the name of terrorism. It's proxy war. Somebody is funding these terrorists for the purpose of controlling, corners of Africa, particularly the Horn of Africa. And therefore, the idea that guns are going to be silenced is not true, because Africa is beginning to be more and more, intervened by external powers. And the game is changing, because previously we had the superpowers. Now we have the middle powers doing the bidding. It's the middle powers. And by middle powers, we mean countries in the Gulf region, Qatar, UAE, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Egypt. All these are now players, and they are playing in terms of their own interests. Previously, they used to be subordinated to a certain superpower. Now they are not. They're working on their own accord. Iran, right? Russia is still there. All these are great powers. And therefore, Africa is now the new arena of these wars. And therefore, silencing the gun is very difficult. And as we celebrate the AU Day tomorrow, the African Day tomorrow, the big question is, what should Africa do to safeguard its own sovereignty and its own future?
Thank you. Ahmed Hashi.
The greatest courage one can have is not to participate in a lie. That's a guy called Alexander Solzhenitsyn, Russian. Nobody likes to quote Russians nowadays, Debal, because there's a big problem over there in Russia. But writers like that stand out and in the dark moments of history in the Gulag Archipelago. We are taught that, it's very easy for you to live in a prison if you do not know that it's a prison. And the last 500 years, Debal, has been a progressive consciousness of prison that has been overlaid on this continent. And it is not high time. It is past time that we took the destiny of this continent and our nations into our own hands and said and say no to the international community and how it's involved in this continent. And it takes responsibility. Debal, in the literature that is taught in the schools by my learned friends, there is this idea that the political class in Africa are a client of vested powers in the rest of the world, Europe and in the United States and in the Western world and China now. And this client kind of mentorship in which the political leaders of this country emerge out of support and acceptance from the rest of the countries that are powerful in the international arena is called a dependency. And the dependency, Debal, is not political, it's also economic. And our professors who sit here teach that. It's called dependency theory. The idea that we're just dependent on a statutory form of power in the international relations. And I think that it's in our economy, it's in our politics, it's in our culture, it's in our worldview. It is awash in the consciousness of people of Africa. And therefore, we have no choice but to have a renaissance. I don't want to use the word revolution because that word happened in Sudan. And guess what happened? The army, probably the most reactionary group in the continent, took guns and now they're shooting at women and children in Sudan who stood up because they refused to accept the price of bread and they wanted a one man, one vote. About simple things, things that are just taken for granted. I want to vote and I want the price of bread to go down. This is why the army intervened. And guess who told the army to intervene, Deval? The Arabs in the Middle East, the Gulf countries, and Saudi Arabia. And whose clients are they? They're the United States clients. Oh, we have to be blunt about these things. What are Arabs doing in the oldest civilization we have in Africa? The people of the Sudan wanted to transform their country. They wanted liberty, and they wanted, for want of another word, to pursue happiness. And why did the army intervene? Why did the army put down that revolution? Because it was instructed to do that. It was instructed. And I believe, Debal, that unless we stop pretending that we have a middle class that's 80% of the population and everybody in Africa eats Kentucky Fried Chicken, we have to stand up and put the ideas in which these societies are living in. It's $1 a day. Poverty is at 90%. Political leadership is zero. We are borrowing 155 billion Kenya shillings from the IMF today. The president said he will not borrow another single cent. He has failed on all the promises that he has given us.
Thank you.
Political leadership is failing. That is where this nonsense comes from. And unless the young people and young people that Dr. Mustafa was talking about, the 85%, stand up and say no, nothing is going to change.
Right. It's 8 o'clock. We need to take a short break. When we circle back, of course, we continue with that and more. We shall be looking at what is happening also in South Africa, where they are looking at options to avoid Vladimir Putin arrest warrant. So we take a short break. We circle back with more. Don't go away.
Ukweli.
Usemwe.
Dubal.
Uongo.
You have to take that.
Ujitengi.